Hi, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I really, really appreciate it. I was just going around in the audience introducing myself and asking individuals what brought them here tonight. And I like to do that because it just relaxes me. It also gives me an idea of who's in the audience. I have, just from my non-scientific sampling, it seems that the human development class is here. Is that right? Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. And thank you, Ms. Blackman, for that wonderful introduction. I love you too. She's a wonderful, wonderful woman and a wonderful resource for the community. And I encourage you to introduce yourself to her before you leave. And thank you, Dr. Wiley. Where's Dr. Wiley? Thank you, Dr. Wiley, for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And you all, whether you're here for extra credit or whether you're here because you're a concerned community member or you may be a member of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Who's a member? Oh, just you and me, Dr. Wiley? You all are welcome to join as well. Okay, the title of my lecture tonight is not really a lecture, a presentation is called The State of Hate and Intolerance in America. The State of Hate and Intolerance in America. And I give this presentation, and my colleagues, a couple of colleagues at the Southern Poverty Law Center, go around the country and give this presentation to raise awareness about what's going on in the country. So I offer you this perspective from the Southern Poverty Law Center. It also offers us an opportunity to let you know what we're doing or what we're trying to do about hate and intolerance in America. Now the story of the Southern Poverty Law Center begins with these two men, Morris Dees on the left and Joe Levin on the right. And I'd like to point out that it was two white men, two white Southerners, born and raised in Montgomery, Alabama, or New Montgomery, Alabama, who started the Southern Poverty Law Center. Morris was raised in the Southern Baptist tradition, and Joe was raised in Reform Judaism. It was these two men who had a vision for the Southern Poverty Law Center and founded it in 1971. Now, as Morris tells the story, Morris is a character in and of himself, but as Morris tells the story, they felt like they had to start the Southern Poverty Law Center in large part because of this man. Do you recognize him? Four-term governor, George Wallace. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama for 4 terms, and he was well on his way to becoming president of the United States before an assassination attempt. Now, George Wallace is the same person that ordered the beating back of nonviolent protesters who attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge and make that march from Selma to Montgomery. I don't know if you can make it out, but the person who's holding his hand over his head bent down, that's now Congressman John Lewis. And I don't know if you know John Lewis. I love John Lewis, and you should do all you can to find out about him. He's a national treasure. He's still serving in the Congress. He represents Georgia. But at that time, Congressman Lewis was 18, 19 years old, and he was one of the co-founders of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And SNCC had taken it upon themselves to lead a march from Selma to Montgomery. Dr. King wasn't a part of this march. This march was led by young people, your age. And they were determined to bring a message to Governor Wallace. But he stopped them at the base of the bridge. As Congressman Lewis says in his story, when they I don't know if you've been on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but it crest up at the top. And he said when they got to the top, all he could see was a sea of blue. Blue state trooper uniforms and cars with tear gas and troopers on horseback and billy clubs, and they beat them all the way back across the bridge back into Selma. These are some of the reasons why the Southern Poverty Law Center was founded. This is an image of Dexter Avenue. We're looking down Dexter Avenue towards the state capitol, and this marks the end of the successful Selma to Montgomery march, also referred to as the Voting Rights March. It took 3 attempts for the people to make it from Selma to Montgomery, not that far. And I say it was successful on the third try, much as the civil rights movement itself was successful because it was multiracial, multi-ethnic, and interfaith. It was a coalition of people who came together to stand up for the rights of marginalized black folks. And I still maintain that had not the civil rights movement been nonviolent and not had support outside of the community, we may still be boycotting somewhere. Now, some of the early cases that the Southern Poverty Law Center took on were, this image represents the desegregation of the Alabama State Troopers. Even though the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed and said, the courts have ruled that everyone should have equal access to anything, any kind of place of service, any job, Alabama refused to integrate its state troopers. They said, well, we just won't hire any state troopers. And they did not hire any state troopers until they were forced to in 1985. We had to take this case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court to force the state to integrate the state troopers. Another early case was the overcrowding of prisons. And I'd like to share this particular image because I think sometimes we get the impression that prisons just became overcrowded. They've been overcrowded for some time because prisons tend to house, again, marginalized, disenfranchised people who society devalues. And so we just put them in cages and don't worry about it. They're locked up and we're safe. But we fought for the rights of marginalized populations then at our founding in 1971 and still do so today. That's our mission, to be advocates for the voiceless, and to litigate their cases in court. We also fought the state of Alabama, and you may think that all of our cases were against the state of Alabama, but you know that's home, so we thought we'd start there. And forced the state to remove the Confederate flag from the top of the Capitol dome. It still flies right across the street, because if you've ever been to Montgomery, you'd know that the first White House of the Confederacy is directly across the street from the U.S. Capitol. But it wasn't those early cases that brought Southern Poverty Law Center some fame or notoriety. It was this woman, her name is Beulah Mae Donald, and she lived in Mobile, Alabama. In 1981, her son, Michael Donald, was abducted by Klansmen. And not just any Klansmen, but Klansmen that belonged to a group called the United Klans of America. Now, the United Klans of America was a pretty notorious group during the Civil Rights Movement. The United Klans of America was a group that set the bomb at 16th Street Baptist Church. You may be familiar with that story, where 4 girls, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins were killed when a bomb went off Sunday morning. But in 1981, Mrs. Donald's son was abducted. They also killed a woman named Viola Liuzzo after the Selma to Montgomery March. She was a white woman who traveled from Detroit to come and help. So the fact that they were still killing people in 1981 was very troubling for Morris Dees in particular. So he decided to sue, that we would sue the Klan. Now the next image shows the brutal murder of Michael Donald. He was lynched. 1981, lynched in Mobile, Alabama, and hung on a tree across the street from the Klansman's home so that he could see how the drama played out and watch people's reaction. He was that sick. So Morris decided, well, we have to do something to put this Klan group out of business. Now, as you know, private citizens cannot bring criminal charges against folks. Finally, the people who committed the murder were brought to justice in criminal court, but we decided to sue them in civil court. And this was new. And Morris based this precedent-setting legal strategy on organized crime laws, where you hold the leader of the organization responsible for the actions of its members. Now, what it was is that the leader of the United Klans of America was upset because a black man, no relation to Michael Donald, was acquitted or found not guilty in the murder of a white police officer. And blacks had just begun to start serving on juries, so he decided that if blacks were going to let a black person off from murdering a white person, as he thought, then a black person should die, and that person happened to be Michael Donald. So the two guys that he got to commit the murder, well, they both really flipped on him. And so we were able to use their testimony after they were convicted and bring down the Klan group in civil court. It was a $7 million judgment against the Klan. And it's significant to note that it was a $7 million judgment brought by an all-white jury in Mobile, Alabama, 1987. Now, Mrs. Donald, of course, didn't get $7 million because they were a Klan group and they didn't have $7 million, but they did have some property. They had an office space in Tuscaloosa. So what we did was got the property, sold it, and gave the money to Mrs. Donald. And then she was able to buy her first family home with those proceeds. But she was most happy about the Klan being put out of business. So that was the first successful lawsuit that the Southern Poverty Law Center brought against a Klan group or a white supremacist group. We've had maybe 15 since then. But it was the Donald case that inspired us to create the Civil Rights Memorial that sits out in front of our office building. And I like to just stop and pause on this particular slide because I believe that it's important to honor, to thank and honor those who came before us. And those who came before us relative to the Civil Rights Movement are honored on the Civil Rights Memorial. This was designed by Maya Lin. She's the woman who designed the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. And this image really doesn't do it justice. I really want to invite each and every one of you to come to Montgomery and experience it for yourself. It's very, very powerful. It's all black granite. There's water rushing down the wall. Once you see the quote, "Until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." Dr. King delivered this line during his speech during the March on Washington. Most people think that's the only time he did it, but he really delivered that line quite often. Very often, in fact, during the Montgomery bus boycott. I think he used it as kind of like a mantra to encourage himself. And that's the way I use it, and that's the way some of my colleagues use it at the office. Because though we made great strides and there were great successes that came out of the civil rights movement at no small cost, there's still much, much, much to be done. And so our charges, my charges, and what I like to relate to my audience members, to your charge as well, and maybe you'll see that at the end of the presentation, that we all must continue until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. The table in front of the wall chronicles the civil rights movement. It begins with Brown v. Board in 1954 and then honors 40 individuals who were killed during that time. This is the spot that honors those 4 girls that I mentioned earlier. 4 young souls who were taken in Birmingham. As I mentioned, we've had a number of successful lawsuits against Klan organizations. Southern Poverty Law Center is a nonprofit organization. We don't charge our clients to represent them, nor do we share any of the award money. But again, important to know, rarely do they get all of that. But a jury brought back a $23 million, $37 million verdict against a group in Portland, Oregon, who beat an African immigrant to death. There was another large settlement out of Idaho where a black woman almost lost her son. He was beaten within an inch of his life. And in this instance, they had a huge compound. And so the family took the property and destroyed the Klan's compound. It was used as a training base. Now, some people think, oh, that was then. Even to know that the Klan kind of existed in the 80s, some people think that, oh, that's the past. But as Dr. Wiley alluded to, or stated quite affirmatively, hate groups are on the rise. Part of the work of the Southern Poverty Law Center since our founding in 1971, when we started as just a small civil rights law firm, is expanding. Now, our intelligence project, the group that tracks and monitors hate group, was a direct outgrowth of our cases against the Klan. Because once we began to sue the Klan, then they began to retaliate against us. And there's been over 30 people who have gone to prison because of attempts to kill Morris or to destroy our offices. In fact, in 1983, our offices were firebombed by some Klansmen. So we started this tracking of them as they watched us, we watched them, and it turned into this larger project in the 80s. So now every year we do an accounting of active hate groups in the United States. This represents the count or the map for 2011. We're always looking back a year. This is, I'm sorry. This represents about a 49% or 69%, sorry, increase in the number of active hate groups since the year 2000. And as you can see, those dots represent where the groups are, and the different icons represent what type of group they are. As you probably guess, the little white hood is for Klan. There are Nazis, there are neo-Nazis, there are skinheads, there are black separatist groups, and any number of general hate groups on the map. You can go to our website at splcenter.org, pull up the hate map, and find out exactly where the hate groups are, what they are, and what they are about. Now, most people today would look at this particular image and think, okay, that's the Klan, I can see it. They're burning a cross, I get it, I'm familiar with that imagery. But this is not necessarily the way they'll present themselves. So you need to be able to recognize them in other ways. But this too is another familiar image. As you know, we live in a democracy, we have free speech rights, and anyone can march down the street and protest. I should note that just because groups are on our hate list or we've listed them as a hate group does not mean that they've committed any crime. It just means that they have their message or their beliefs and practices are to malign a group of individuals or an entire class of people based on typically immutable characteristics. So even though we can look at this image of these Nazi skinheads marching down the street and say they have a perfect right to do that, we're saddened because notice the child in the picture. And children growing up in this way are more likely to keep with that way of thinking. Today, though, we also have to recognize it would be unfair to say that all hate groups or all people who belong to hate groups are white, though the vast majority of hate groups on our list are white supremacists in nature. The Nation of Islam is and has been on our hate group list for quite some time. This is Minister Farrakhan. The Nation of Islam, though it may do very wonderful things, is very anti-white, anti-Semitic, anti-gay. And he spews this hateful rhetoric quite often. Another religious, quote-unquote, religious leader who spews a lot of hate, this is Fred Phelps. He's the pastor and minister of Westboro Baptist Church in Kansas City, in Topeka, Kansas, I'm sorry. He's the one that goes around to the funerals of service members and protests and says that they deserve to die because the United States is soft on gays, on homosexuals. And most people, not most people, but a lot of people think that he just started doing that. But Fred Phelps began his protesting of funerals back at the beginning of the AIDS crisis. He used to go to the funerals of people who died or he thought died because of HIV/AIDS. And then he changed his tactics and started to going to funerals of U.S. service members. So that is those are the kind of current faces of hate. And then in your own Florida, down in Gainesville, Dove Ministries, what's the guy's name, Terry something? You know what I'm talking about? He had the Burn Grande. No? Oh my gosh, this is your state, you should know this guy. Last year, he wanted to host a Burn the Grande. And he got all kind of support from all kind of extremists across the country. It was an international crisis. The Secretary of Defense contacted him and asked him not to do that. There were going to be repercussions, and there were, to U.S. service members if he did this. And he said he wasn't going to, even the president had asked him not to do it, and he said he would not, but then he did it anyway, sometime afterwards, and there were repercussions, I believe in Pakistan or Afghanistan. But he not only encourages people to burn a Quran, which is beyond me why someone who calls himself a religious leader would encourage people to burn a religious book. He designed these t-shirts and passed them out to parishioners, and they walk around town with this. This represents the current base of hate and intolerance in America. And then, of course, you're likely familiar with the crisis or the tragedy that happened last month or 2 months ago now in Wisconsin, the Sikh temple, where someone who was on our hate watch list, we had identified him and he'd been in our database for 10 years, walked into a Sikh temple and just started shooting. So hate does exist, continues to exist in this country. So let's look at the map again. As I mentioned, there's been an increase, a steady increase since the year 2000, as you can see from this slide. And it's constantly gone up. There was a kind of a little bit of a drop around 2004. And if you note too, in 2008, there was a big climb. Now, at least you think that Florida is immune. No state is immune. I'm originally from California, and California's #1 in hate groups. But this is what Florida looks like. And again, I encourage you to go to the website, pull it up, and see what these groups are, where they are, and what they're about. I think it's vitally important that you know who's around you. In addition to just the icon on the location, it tells you, as I mentioned, who they are, what they're about, what kind of hate group they are, and it gives you their relative location. So what are the drivers of this? Why is hate increasing when we know from research that at least the current generation is certainly a lot more tolerant and accepting of racial difference than previous generations. And do have an African American president. What's going on? Well, oh shoot, this is not supposed to be my slide. Oh well. I mentioned to you already what a hate group was. I'm so sorry. Maybe I should tell you what a hate crime is. Hate crimes, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, hate groups do not have to have committed a crime to land on our hate group list. But if they were to commit a hate crime, and hate crimes are very, very difficult to prove. A hate crime is first you have to commit an actual crime, say robbery, say murder. And then law enforcement has to prove that the primary motivation for the commission of the crime was bias based on some protected class. It's very, very difficult to prove bias. You can sometimes, if the person had, hate literature at their home, or they were kind of known for belonging to a hate group, they could use that in court, and still it would not necessarily bring a hate crime conviction. So even though we have hate crime laws, hate crimes on their own are very, very difficult to prove. There's some federal legislation that helps us to kind of increase our success in the conviction rate around hate crimes, but there's not foolproof. Now, one of the main drivers of the increase in the number of hate groups is the shifting demographics in our country. Now, I'm sure you've all heard this fact that goes around that by the year 2042, 2050 for sure, the country will be majority minority, which is to say that there'll be more people of color than whites. Then, with that information, kind of every few months or so, it seems that there's a news story out. Like I remember a few months ago, there was a story that said there were more babies of color born than there were white babies born. And that was like the first time that happened. And those bits of information, or those facts about the shifting demographics in our country really bother people. Because in 1970, it looked like this. I can't read it from here, but I think it's like 87-37. What is it? Thank you. There were a lot more white people than people of color in 1970. Today, kind of bridging the gap, and then as I mentioned, by 2042, it'll be pretty even. And people of color will outnumber whites. Now again, it's a fact. And it's a fact that not a lot of people are ready to accept. In places like Florida, you've seen, you certainly have a lot of diversity. In California, we have diversity. In California, Texas, Arizona are already places that are already majority-minority states. But in places like Idaho and Middle America, in Alabama, where I'll talk about later, our whole kind of pushback on immigrants, where immigrants are maybe 4.5% of the population, they'll just freak out. So this is why. And so, so people begin to act out badly. They may commit a hate crime, or they may just commit a hate incident like this, like tagging some graffiti. And these are important for community members and law enforcement to kind of pay attention to. If you see hate graffiti, if you see something like this tagged on, on the street or on the wall, it means something, and you should pay attention to it. It means that someone is not handling the diversity well. And we do well to speak to it now before it turns into an actual crime. The Bureau of Crime Statistics report a tremendous jump in the number of anti-Latino, specific anti-Latino hate crimes. And this is because of this ongoing this ongoing rhetoric about immigration. And our conversations about immigration turn into a denigration of those who we think are immigrants. And those who we think are immigrants are typically Latino. And that results in hate crimes against them. Sometimes hate groups pick it up. This is the guy in the center. His name is Ron Edwards, and he's the head of a group called the Imperial Clans of America. The men behind him are members. And Ron Edwards was in Kentucky, and he was kind of trying to do a little recruiting thing in Kentucky, and he needed new members. This is our client, Jordan Groover, and he was 16 years old. This was back in 2006. He was 16 years old and decided to go to the county fair with his friends in Brandenburg, Kentucky. He always went to the fair. Brandon, I don't know if you can tell, but he's biracial, and his father is a Kuna Indian and his mom's white. But when he went to the fair one night with his friends, two of Ron Edwards' members ran into him. Now, Ron Edwards had sent these two guys to the county fair to recruit new members. But they saw Brandon and tagged Brandon as, in their words, an illegal spick, and proceeded to beat him. Now, the guy on the right is like 6'5" almost, and huge. And the guy on the left, not as large, but scary nonetheless. The swastika on his chest, that says murder across his collarbone, and his knuckles spell out violence. And these two attacked Jordan Groover, who's like 5'2", 110 pounds. And they beat him within an inch of his life. He was really lucky to get away. So we decided to sue Ron Edwards and the United Clans of America and brought back a $2.5 million judgment against that organization. Now again, Jordan didn't get the money, but it greatly reduces the number of IKA, Imperial Clans of America, chapters across the United States. Because Ron Edwards not only had this chapter in Kentucky, he had all those dots represent chapters of the Imperial Clans of America. So they probably had a dozen or so before our lawsuit. After our lawsuit, they've been reduced to just a few. And so that's what makes us feel really good. We are trying to eliminate these hate groups by suing them. We sue them to put them out of business, to bankrupt them. Because they'll never be able to pay the judgment off, and if they were able to pay the judgment off, they would never have enough money to keep surviving and recruiting new members. Now, demographic shifts is one reason for the increase in the number of hate groups, and as Dr. Wiley mention, so is our president. Right after President Obama was inaugurated, this group called the National Socialist Movement, which is the largest white supremacist group in the country, they have a website that has over 250,000 registered users. It crashed on the night of inauguration because so many people wanted to sign up. They said, and David Duke and some other white supremacists said, see, we told you this was going to happen, and now we have a black person in charge, and whites, are continuing to lose power. So you need to join with us. So they saw it, they turned this around and turned this into kind of a recruiting tool for themselves. The National Socialist Movement that I mentioned with the 250,000 registered members, this is their magazine, this was their cover right after President Obama was inaugurated. And it's not just, kind of bona fide or registered white supremacists or registered hate groups who spew or put out these ugly things about the president. But you'll recall that at the beginning of this whole Obamacare debate, do you remember seeing all these signs, all this, and you might still see these today because there's still that ongoing birther argument that just, I don't know, indicate a certain ugliness is with us. And it's hard to ignore. And we can say that it's political, and we can say, yes, one party's empowering the other, this is what happens. But I ask us to look at the imagery. It's quite different. The third driver, we identify three: shifting demographics, the election of President Obama, and then this whole anti-immigrant thing as drivers for the increase in the number of hate groups. Now, even as we continue to debate quote-unquote illegal immigrants being in the United States, we continue to use them as cheap labor. And Florida is quite a consumer of that cheap labor. This was an agricultural company. The leader was quoted as saying this about the new sharecroppers. And this really does represent a lot of what some people feel. And so the Southern Poverty Law Center brought a suit a couple years ago against Del Monte. And we have an immigrant justice project that started in 2005. And the Immigrant Justice Project was created to protect the rights of workers, and immigrant workers in particular, migrant workers specifically. I should say that the majority of our clients are documented workers. What happens is that big companies like Del Monte or other multinational companies get guest worker visas and then go to other countries, Mexico, Guatemala, Brazil, India, and say, we need workers. Come, and we'll pay you a decent wage, we'll pay you this amount of money, and it'll be great. And people are desperate for work and agree to do so. Then when they get here, they don't get paid what the wage that they were told they were going to be paid. And they're kept in conditions that are close to slavery. Oftentimes kept in kind of housing that's near the field and then brought from the housing to the field to the housing, and that's it. And that's their life, that's their existence. And one of the things that's wrong with that's wrong with the guest worker program is that guest worker visas tie the person to the employer. So that if you come and you work for Del Monte, then you don't like it, you don't like the working conditions, you can't complain, otherwise they'll revoke your visa and you can go back. Okay, you don't like it, you can go back, and we'll get other workers. So this has